In 1834, the United States Treasury was empty. The young republic was drowning in debt, scrambling for capital, struggling to stand on the world stage. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, in a narrow strip of land no larger than a football field, sat a man who could have bought the entire American government twice. They called him the godfather of the Canton trade. The British hated him. The Americans worshipped him. He wasn't an emperor. He wasn't a general. He was a middleman. His name was Howqua. And for a brief, terrifying moment in history, he was the richest man on earth. But this isn't a success story. It is a warning. Because Howqua discovered the one thing that money cannot buy when an empire decides to take it from you. Most financial history is just propaganda. But here, we read the hidden ledgers. If you want to understand the mechanics of power that they don't teach you in school, you know what to do. Welcome to the investigation. Now, let's open the vault. To understand the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of Howqua's wealth, you must first understand the airlock. The Qing emperors viewed foreign trade not as an opportunity, but as a contagion. They didn't want Western ideas, Western gods, or Western guns entering the mainland. So, in their wisdom and arrogance, they created the Canton system, a quarantine zone for capitalism. For nearly a century, all trade between China and the West was funneled through one single port, Canton, and within that port, the foreigners were restricted to a tiny, claustrophobic district on the riverbank known as the 13 Factories. Imagine a strip of land barely 1,000 feet long. This was the entire world for the Western traders. They were legally forbidden from dealing with anyone outside this zone. They couldn't walk into the walled city of Canton. They couldn't learn the Chinese language. They were forbidden from bringing their wives or families. It was a bachelor's prison of high-stakes commerce, sweltering heat, and immense greed. And the wardens of this golden prison were a monopoly guild known as the Ko Hong. If you were a British lord arriving in a massive East Indiaman ship, or a Boston merchant in a small clipper, you had no choice. You could not buy a single leaf of tea, nor sell a single crate of wool without going through one of these authorized Chinese merchants. And sitting at the very top of this pyramid, the leader of the senior Hongs was Wu Bingjian, known to the foreigners as Howqua. Howqua wasn't just a trader. He was the central nervous system of the global economy. He managed the prices. He controlled the logistics. He even managed the Kansu Fund, a secret insurance pool that covered the debts of any bankrupt merchant, ensuring the system never failed. While Western markets in London and New York crashed and burned in panic every 10 years, Howqua's system was stable, predictable, and ruthlessly efficient. By 1834, his personal estate was valued at 26 million silver dollars. Let me give you context for that number. That was enough to fund the entire British Royal Navy for a year. It was more liquid capital than the reserves of the Bank of France. He was the Jeff Bezos of his time, but with one crucial difference. Bezos has shareholders and a board of directors. Howqua answered only to the emperor, but wealth creates enemies. The British East India Company, the most powerful corporation in history, hated him. They saw him as a barrier, a tyrant who dictated prices to the crown. They treated him with the typical colonial arrogance of the era. But the Americans? The Americans were different. They arrived in Canton late. They were the underdogs of the 19th century. They came in smaller, faster ships. They had no navy to back them up, no queen to protect them. They were hungry, scrappy, and often broke. Howqua saw something in these men. He saw potential. He formed deep, personal alliances with young American traders like John Murray Forbes and the Russell family. He didn't just do business with them. He adopted them into his financial family. There is a legendary account that perfectly illustrates this relationship. A young Boston trader, desperate and homesick, owed Howqua $72,000. In today's money, that is millions. He couldn't pay. He was terrified he would be arrested or kept in China forever as a debtor. He planned to flee. Howqua found out. He summoned the young American to his estate. The American was shaking, expecting ruin. Instead, Howqua asked him why he wanted to leave. When the man explained he missed his home but couldn't leave until he paid, Howqua simply called for his ledger. He took out the promissory note, the piece of paper worth a fortune, and he tore it to shreds. He threw it into the fire. "You are an honest man," Howqua said, "but you have bad luck. Bad luck is not a crime. Now, go home." He wrote off a fortune just to help a friend. But Howqua was playing a longer game. This gesture bought him loyalty that money alone could never secure. The American trading house, Russell and Company, effectively became Howqua's investment vehicle. He entrusted millions of his own silver dollars to these Americans. He told them, "Take this money, invest it in your country." And they did. That Chinese capital traveled back to Boston and New York. It fueled the American Industrial Revolution. It helped build the transcontinental railroad that conquered the Wild West. It funded the early textile mills of New England. It built the Bell Telephone Company. If you trace the genealogy of American old money, the dynasties that still hold power today, you will often find, hidden in the footnotes of their history, a Chinese silent partner standing in the shadows. Before China was known as the world's factory, it was the world's bank. And Howqua was the banker. But every golden age has an expiration date, and the Canton system had a fatal flaw. The balance of trade was too one-sided. Europe was addicted to Chinese goods. They couldn't get enough tea, silk, and porcelain. But China bought nothing. The Chinese viewed Western goods as inferior oddities. They didn't need British wool in the humid South. They didn't want Western clocks or mechanical toys. As a result, silver flowed into China. And nothing flowed out. The trade deficit was draining the Bank of England. The British Empire, the master of the seas, was bleeding silver. They faced an economic crisis. So, the British merchants, led by aggressive free traders, decided to sell the only thing China couldn't refuse: opium. They called it the Black Mud, grown in British India, auctioned by the East India Company, and smuggled into China by private traders. It was illegal. It was immoral, and it was incredibly profitable. Almost overnight, the balance of power shifted. The silver Howqua had carefully accumulated began to flow out of China at a catastrophic rate. Millions of Chinese became addicts. The army, the bureaucracy, even the palace eunuchs were smoking the pipe. The Daoguang Emperor was furious. In 1839, he sent his Iron Commissioner, Lin Zexu, to Canton with a mandate from heaven: cut off the source, stop the opium, or die trying. Lin was a man of absolute integrity. He could not be bribed. He could not be intimidated. On his arrival, he didn't negotiate. He laid siege to the 13 factories. For 6 weeks, Howqua and his Western friends were locked inside the factory district. They were cut off from food and water. Servants were withdrawn. The richest men in the world were suddenly prisoners, sweating in the heat, terrified for their lives. Commissioner Lin held Howqua responsible. He stripped the old merchant of his rank. He forced Howqua, a man in his 70s, to wear a kangi, a heavy wooden pillory locked around his neck. He was paraded in front of the factories as a traitor. Howqua was caught in the ultimate trap. To the British, he was the face of the restrictive Chinese government, the enemy of free trade. To the emperor, he was a collaborator who had allowed the barbarians to poison the Middle Kingdom. The man who owned the world was now a prisoner of his own success. The siege ended, but not with a handshake. It ended with a salvo. The British government, using the seizure of opium as a pretext, sent the Royal Navy. But this time, they didn't send wooden ships. They sent the Nemesis, the first iron-hulled steam warship to ever fight in Asia. The first Opium War was not a war. It was a massacre. The modern British gunboats obliterated the Chinese coastal defenses. They sailed up the Yangtze River, cutting the empire in half. The Chinese junk ships, built on centuries of tradition, were blown to splinters. And when the British guns finally aimed at the city of Canton, Howqua had to make a choice. He negotiated the ransom of Canton. To save his city from being looted, raped, and burned by the British forces, Howqua and the Kohong merchants paid a bribe of 6 million silver dollars to the British commanders. But that wasn't enough. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking. It was a humiliating surrender. China was forced to cede Hong Kong to the British. They were forced to open 5 new ports to trade, and they were forced to pay $21 million in war reparations. The Qing government was bankrupt. They had no silver. So, they turned to the only man who did. They turned to Howqua. "You made the money from the barbarians," the officials said. "Now you pay them." Howqua liquidated his warehouses. He emptied his vaults. He sold off his assets. It is estimated that he personally contributed over a third of the total reparations paid by the Chinese Empire. It is the ultimate irony of his life. The richest man in the world spent his final years paying for the war that destroyed his own monopoly. He bought peace for his country, but he paid for his own destruction. Howqua died in 1843, just months after the treaties were signed. He died a broken man. In a broken system, the Canton system was abolished. The Kohong was dissolved. The world he ruled had evaporated into the smoke of the opium pipes and the cannon fire. His American partners, the Forbes, the Delanos, the Russells, they took their profits and sailed away. They returned to Boston and New York to build the Ivy League universities, the libraries, and the banks that rule the Western world today. They became the titans of the American century. But Howqua was left behind. His legacy was buried under the century of humiliation. Today, few people in the West even know his name. He is a ghost in the ruins of the old world. So, what is the lesson of Howqua? It is a lesson that every modern billionaire, every crypto tycoon, and every tech giant should study closely. Howqua believed that being system critical would save him. He believed that because he held the purse strings, he held the power. He thought commerce could civilize conflict. He was wrong. In the grand calculus of history, wealth is just soft power. And soft power always exists at the mercy of hard power. You can own the bank, you can own the supply chain, you can own the algorithm, but the man with the gunboat, the man with the political violence, always sets the final exchange rate. Howqua was the smartest man in the room, but the room was burning. Howqua is gone, but the game hasn't changed. The players just wear different suits. We are building a dossier on the other invisible architects of the modern economy. Stories you won't find on the news. If you want to see who holds the gunboats today, make sure you are subscribed.